Jackie Chan is one of those actors who, to me, has just felt like they've always been around. Which, in a way, is true for myself, but I think many feel the same way. He's one of the very few actors in the world that has achieved a higher level of celebrity status. If you bring up Jackie Chan almost anywhere in the world, they'll know who he is. That's not easy to do, and at the time of his rise to fame, it was barely seen as something even possible. I mean, even today, the West still has a strong grasp on the whole entertainment industry at large, but at the time, the icons were charming and serious American-born heroes like Clint Eastwood. This made the idea of a Chinese-born stuntman rising to fame a little out of the realm of what people thought was possible. But as we now know today, it was. Jackie wasn't the one leading the charge though, and I think that brings us to the only place you can start when talking about the Hong Kong movie industry. Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, of course, was the man that shined a light on the Hong Kong industry for the rest of the world. He was a very strong-willed and talented man. Though he was never considered the perfect fighter, he sure knew how to entertain and make us believe he was one. Jackie, like many people in the Hong Kong industry, looked up to Bruce, as he was exactly what everyone else wanted to be. The only issue was, Jackie was just a little bit behind, only being a lowly stuntman getting paid practically nothing when Bruce Lee was just entering his prime. Jackie most likely would have stayed this way, getting steady stunt gigs, but never fully being able to reach his potential if it weren't for one fateful day. Jackie was filming on set of Enter the Dragon, which was one of his first big on-screen appearances. Though still just a stuntman, this time was different, as he would be able to fight Bruce Lee on screen. The moment he ran out into the scene though, he was struck in the head with a pole by the man himself. A little dazed, he could hear Bruce running over to make sure he was okay. This would begin what Jackie hoped to be a lifelong friendship, as from there on out, Bruce seemed to take care of him, helping him get gigs on set, and overall just being a great career mentor. This friendship, sadly though, wouldn't be the lifelong one Jackie had hoped for, as on July 20th, 1973, he passed away from a reaction to medication. This, of course, sent the Hong Kong industry into utter chaos. Everyone immediately began looking for who could become the new Bruce Lee. This is when Jackie's career really began. Jackie had now found himself as the guy who was meant to represent the Hong Kong industry at large when he had never even headed a movie except for a very small film when he was only 17. He truly was just dropped into the spotlight and was expected to become the new Bruce Lee overnight. He was even forced into learning Lee's style for his first big movie, New Fist of Fury. Already, he had a large looming shadow of his idol over him going into this film, but it being a sequel of one of Lee's most popular films put him in an even worse position for comparison. The movie did alright, but by no means was it a success like they had hoped. A lot of people might think that would end a career, but the industry saw promise in Jackie. He was highly skilled and an entertainer at heart. The biggest issue with the way that people saw him was they were looking for a new Bruce Lee, and the industry wasn't helping as they were pushing him this way as well. For a few years, Jackie had a period where he was doing very serious, medieval period, Lee-esque movies, and they were alright. A few good fights, okay stories, but it didn't really fit. Jackie wasn't Lee, and everyone knew that. This all changed with the release of movies like Drunken Master, Half a Loaf of Kung Fu, and my favorite of the bunch, Spiritual Kung Fu. These movies together began a new era in his career and the beginnings of the man we know today. Spiritual Kung Fu came out in 1978 and was directed by the great Lo Wei, who had worked with Jackie many times before. I feel as if around this time was when Lo Wei and Jackie really began to find their rhythm. As I've stated many times before, Jackie wasn't Bruce Lee at all. At heart, he was a funny guy who just wanted to entertain. And after the large success of a movie like Drunken Master, I think the industry realized that was okay, and that comedy was an option for Kung Fu. Jackie looked up to guys like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, the greats of the silent era. This came through a lot in the way he chose to choreograph his fights and the great physical comedy skills he displayed starting with these early works. Spiritual Kung Fu has a nice mesh of comedy and drama, and like with all his films, some awesome fights. The comedy with the Ghost Masters in this film had me laughing the whole time, which is something you would never even think of coming from a Lee movie. This was for sure one of the turning points in his career, and the beginning of Jackie movies. This movie, and a few others in the period I haven't mentioned, is where you begin to see one of my favorite aspects of a Jackie Chan movie. Bruce Lee always seemed to be this omnipotent force in his films. It almost seemed like no one could stand in his way, which for a hero story can work, but Jackie doesn't go that route. Almost all his movies from this point on feature a work your way to the top storyline. I would say by the end of a lot of his movies, he still isn't a master either. Jackie tries to humanize himself in a genre where that isn't done very often. In Kung Fu movies, they want to show power, and for the most part, that's pretty hard to do if your protagonist isn't good at Kung Fu. When Jackie does it though, it works. It makes it just that much more enjoyable to feel like maybe even you can work your way up as he has. Jackie by far is the most human actor in the genre. He does a lot of things a hero wouldn't, but normal people would. For example, Jackie is always running, which may seem cowardly, but it's really smart. He maybe starts running if he notices he's losing, or he'll run off to a spot that might give him a better advantage. Though this tactic might make him look a little less strong and honorable, it's the human response. Doing whatever you can to get the upper hand in a fight is the goal, which is also why you'll see him swinging chairs and rocks at people just in an attempt to gain an advantage. But there's one thing you might not notice in his films that make them so much easier to connect with. He gets hurt. Unlike a lot of his seniors in his movies, Jackie isn't afraid to show weakness. He gets hurt in every fight, shaking out his fist after a punch, or just a facial expression that lets the audience know he's in pain. I feel like this human aspect of his movies attribute a lot to the popularity of them. This success giving him the ability to direct his own films. The Fearless Hyena was Jackie's directorial debut, and for a first film, it's pretty good. Most debuts are a little rocky and suffer from a lot of the same issues. You can see a few of them here, like story pacing, but the same Jackie Chan comedy and rhythmic fighting is present. Already from this first film, you can see the shift into using a lot more visual storytelling tools to help create a more well-rounded film. Less of the long-held shots that mean nothing from the early days, to a far more thought-out shooting style. Jackie still, of course, loves his long-held shots where you can see everything, as many Hong Kong directors did at the time, but I find his use of the camera a little more intriguing than the rest. He sets up each new stunt or fight perfectly, and uses multiple Hong Kong staple editing techniques to get the power of each hit across. Though this movie specifically may not have as much of these, he for sure gets there in his later works. This brings us to the mid-80s, and what I consider to be the beginning of Jackie's prime, with the release of Police Story and later Police Story 2. Both these movies were written and directed by the man himself, and are personally my favorites of all his work. I feel that these two movies encompassed a style that over as many years of filmmaking he created. These two movies bring together all the things I've mentioned, such as camera work, rhythm, and comedy to create something magical. The two Police Story films also were some of the movies I find helped modernize the Kung Fu genre as a whole, meshing story, comedy, and action perfectly. All the fights in these movies are near perfect and display such power, not just with Jackie's overall abilities, but also in the use of far more advanced editing techniques and camera angles than earlier in his career. Not to mention the crazy stunts that will have you on the edge of your seat the whole time. This including debatably my favorite Jackie Chan stunt, the bus scene, which shows Jackie holding on to a speeding bus with nothing but an umbrella. These stunts were just at another level than anything ever done in America. Also, I feel as if Jackie, after working with the same people for so long, finally had a crew that could keep up with him. These movies fully show Jackie flying guns a-blazing into every scene, which is just a beautiful thing to see. I feel as if his career to that point had really led up to this, and in my opinion, these two films truly define what a Jackie Chan movie really is. Overall, Jackie had and is still having an amazing career even at the age of 66. His movies are loved worldwide and create so much happiness for audiences young and old. Though today, with various political matters, he might not be the Hong Kong golden boy he was back then, or his American films never reaching the same quality that his original works did, I don't think that can ever take away from the success that he's built, or take away the love that so many, including myself, have for his films and his style. When you go see a Jackie Chan movie, you don't go to see a kung fu film. You go to see him. And I think that's something that can never be downplayed. Creating what seems like a whole genre around one person is amazing. And I think it's something that even Bruce Lee would be proud to see.